Hey, everybody, welcome back to We Gotta Talk. I'm Sunny. I am so glad you're here today after what has turned out to be kind of a long break. I took the past couple of months off doing all the summer things that we were doing. And even though the official season of We Gotta Talk doesn't kick off until September, I've been having some great conversations in the background and I want to share them with you. So, over the next couple of weeks, expect some interviews that I've been doing in the background to kind of populate your feed here and there. And like I said, season 7, which is crazy to me. It's crazy. 7 seasons. Kicks off next month, and you can expect much of the same real talk on big topics, a lot of stuff that's happening in the world and in the headlines lately, as well as a ton of fun conversations about health and beauty and life and women's fun things. So, all the superficial fun stuff that we kind of like to chat about and focus on to distract us from the bigger and heavier stuff. And I'm not going to lie, today's interview is kind of bigger and it's kind of heavier. I want to tell you about why I'm doing it before we talk about what the interview is about and who it is that I'm speaking with. So, um, there are a lot of things that happen in the world that it's almost impossible to keep track of. Every little news headline, every little opinion about what's happening. And I do make it a practice, as you know, if you're a subscriber to the Substack, to track headlines pretty regularly. And there was one thread that I kept seeing kind of over the course of the past 3 years. A lot of things happening, conversations happening. And I was like, something seems a little different these days. Today, we're talking about anti Semitism, which is frankly not a topic I will be very open with you right off the top that directly impacts me or my family. I'm Italian Catholic. I was raised around 99.9% Catholic people. I had a very, very narrow understanding of the Jewish experience for a really long time, not because of a lack of interest or lack of whatever, but just a lack of exposure. Um, and circling back to tracking the headlines, when I started to track that, a lot more things are happening to the Jewish community these days than they have in a long time. I did a little digging. And I found some really interesting numbers here that prove that maybe this was not my imagination. The ADL, the Anti Defamation League, uh, tracks anti Semitic incidents. They recorded 9,354 incidents in 2024 alone, which is the highest number since the organization began tracking these events in 1979. Physical assaults up 21%. Incidents on college campuses, however, we qualify that, up 84% from the year before. Looked at the FBI. The FBI is also showing that even though Jews make up just 2% of the US population, anti Jewish hate crimes, as classified by the FBI, accounted for nearly 70% of all reported religion based hate crimes in 2024. That's the highest number that the FBI has recorded since 1991. Now, listen, what often starts off as someone else's problem today becomes everyone else's problem tomorrow. This interview isn't to scare you or to hype anything up or to say you should care just because someday it will impact you. This interview is simply there to do what it did for me, which is educate me on a chapter, multiple chapters in history that, as someone not in the Jewish community, I really was not familiar with. So, um, yeah, that's why we're doing this today, understanding, as we always do, the broader context of what's happening, not just in our own little world and bubble, but outside of it as well. So anyhow, today's guest is the author of this book. It's called Antisemitism and American Tradition, and it's by Professor Pamela Nadell. Dr. Nadell is one of the nation's foremost scholars of American Jewish history. She holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University. She directs its Jewish Studies program. She has testified before Congress about anti Semitism, and she's written a really interesting book that tracks this phenomenon, this not great phenomenon, through history. So we kind of go in a chronological order, all the way back to medieval Spain and Portugal, through colonial America, the Henry Ford era, the Holocaust, and then of course October 7th and beyond. And we talk about a lot. Like I said, I'm ignorant to this topic, less so after talking with Dr. Nadell, but we talk about things like, of course, the rise in these reported anti-Semitic incidents, the warning signs that history is may offer us today, and a topic that I think you probably have seen a discussion or two about on social media. What is anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism? What are the distinctions that are made, if any, between those two terms? So, whether you agree with every conclusion or not, whether you agree with um, me doing this interview or not, I sincerely hope that you leave this interview with some more historical context, some more nuance, and really a deeper understanding of an issue that has really become impossible to ignore. Truly. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Pamela Nadell. Hi, Pamela. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, I introduced you and gave the listeners a little bit of your background, kind of from the official standpoint, but I wanted to explain a little bit more the reason why I wanted to have you on today. And we talked about a little bit of this before we hit record here, but I'm really, really passionate about bringing to the forefront issues that just normal people may not see happening, undercurrents, things, trends, things that are happening maybe in political discourse or culturally speaking that people just don't tap into because their daily routine kind of doesn't have them in those circles. And I think the conversation about anti Semitism right now is so important because even as a non Jew, I am seeing so many troubling things happen, not just in the US, but worldwide. And I really felt strongly about having someone who could properly speak to some of the history of this and most importantly, where you think things could be going and a way to intervene in the best possible way. So I do want to thank you for coming on and accepting my cold email and being a guest on the show. I just wanted to start by saying thank you. This is important.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's so important to have these conversations. You don't have the news feed that I have, where every day I get a list of the latest anti-Semitic incidents in the United States.
It's Pamela, it's wild. I did not have much interaction growing up around Jewish people. I told you I'm an Italian Catholic. I'm from Pittsburgh. Culturally speaking, it's a city where you just kind of all the immigrants came, they plopped in their own neighborhoods, and that's that. I don't think I understood just how very pervasive anti-Semitism has always been. So for the new ear to this topic, newish ear, maybe someone whose only knowledge of the topic is what happened in World War II, what how bad is it? I guess that's the simplest way. And how bad has it always been?
The first thing that I would say is right now it's really bad. I mean, we're in a moment that as early as 2021, I was calling, we're now in the high tide of American anti-Semitism. As far as the question about, where has it always been? I mean, we really have to go back to Christianity and what you learned growing up, which is reading the Gospels and the idea that the Jews called for the murder of Jesus, and then the idea that the church fathers created, which was that the Jews should be tolerated, but they should always live in very difficult circumstances. And
Maybe
that's,
I
yeah.
yeah, it's so I don't remember ever I mean, listen, I was doing a bunch of things during mass that I probably shouldn't have been. But I am proud to say that my recollection, I guess in this case, ignorance is good because I don't ever remember having a parish or a priest to espouse that. And I remember growing up learning about World War II and being like, I don't get it. Like, why do people hate them? Like, this makes no sense. Um, for someone who has chronicled this from an academic perspective for so long, I hate to have you compare things because any incident that puts any person in danger is bad. But if you were to compare the roots of this, how this all started, and we will get into anti-Semitism from a chronological perspective, but how bad is what you're seeing happening today relative to what has happened, maybe some of the bigger historical issues that we've known about?
So it's so interesting that you reference the Holocaust, because the idea is that, and there are Holocaust museums and memorials all across the United States, including a huge one on the National Mall in Washington,
Hmm.
D.C. And I think there was the idea that if we would only learn the
Hmm.
lesson of the horror of the Holocaust, and we would learn that in the United States and around the world, that Jew hatred would disappear. And of course, the Jew hatred, the justification for the Jew hatred of the Holocaust was that the Jews were a degenerate racial group and that they endangered the Aryan race. And so, therefore, they had to be exterminated root and branch. And that led to the extermination of 6 million men, women, and children. And what we have at the moment is we have the legacy coming from the right of that idea that the Jews remain a degenerate race that's dangerous to the whites. But we also have at the moment what's coming from the left, which is that the Jews have created this state that in Israel, this settler colonial society, and that needs to be destroyed.
Yeah, I think what I've learned is that this conversation or this topic has taken on it wears so many different masks. It's almost difficult to keep up with, okay, and I said this in the beginning, like, okay, wait, as a person just observing history, first it was hate coming from the left, and then it was modern America, and it was coming from the right and the white supremacists, and now it's coming from the left and the right again. I mean, it must feel like as a member of this community, just being a constant punching bag of sorts for people's given frustration at the moment.
So I'll give you three really contemporary examples, which I'm sure our listeners had, read about or could have read about. In January of this year, a synagogue in Jackson, Mississippi, was firebombed by a man who yelled that he did this because it's a synagogue of Satan. And so by the time you were in Catholic school, you probably didn't pay a lot of attention to that, but that's straight out of the New Testament. So classic Christian anti-Judaism. And then what we have is if we go to the attack on Temple Israel in West Bloomfield, Michigan, where a man who believed that Israel is pure evil, that's a quote from what he said, and he loaded up a pickup truck with explosives and rammed it through the front doors of a synagogue, wanting to kill as many Michigan Jews
Oh God.
as he could. So we're getting it from all these sides all at once. It's why this moment is so particularly fraught.
Let's take it back. What I love about your book is, like I said, it breaks it down chronologically. I'm going to show you guys. It's called Antisemitism and American Tradition. But in the course of the book, you also talk about roots that have happened internationally. So, and if I get anything wrong, Pamela, you have to correct me because, again, this is something that I want people listening to get the facts and the real story here. So, you go all the way back to like medieval Iberia, Spain, Portugal, the history of these forced conversions, the Inquisition, the Autos da Fe. Why is that an important foundation for understanding modern anti-Semitism?
It's important for understanding modern anti-Semitism because it actually has the element of both Christian anti-Judaism and racial anti-Semitism already sort of merging. So what people don't remember is that the Inquisition, and I bet most of our listeners have heard of that, the Inquisition, with
Mhm.
its burning people at the stake and its torture and its torture chambers and its trials, the Inquisition could only try Catholics because, and the people they were trying were Jews at one time. Some of them remained Jewishly affiliated, but they'd been physically violently persecuted starting in the late 1390s, so way back. And many of them saved their lives by being dragged to the baptismal fonts. And then what happens after that is that in Spain, they become suspicious, both Spain and Portugal, they become suspicious that these people, after a generation, and they're raising their children, and what are they doing? They're secretly practicing Judaism, which makes them heretics. And if there's heresy in the church, the Messiah is not going to come again. So what do? They establish the Inquisition. They go after those people who have to, prove that they're faithful Catholics, but of course they're not able to. And so and some of them were not. Some of them were secretly Jewish. And the reason I start there is because some of them managed to escape Spain and Portugal, and eventually they came to what became the United States.
Which is an era you also cover, New Amsterdam, which is now New York. I mean, this it seems like Jews have been escaping from everywhere for always. It is a really painful thing to consider when you look at the span of it and like look as you do in your book. It's like, my God, when does the break happen? When do you get a break? This is escaping from one location in the world to another. That place becomes promising for a time, and we'll get into New Amsterdam and colonial America, and then that goes bad. Um,
Mm.
anyway, let's save modern times for a little while down because I really want to lay the foundation. But let's follow those people. Let's track from modern day Spain and Portugal to America. They're coming to America.
Right. So they come
What
to America. First Jews come in 1654. They're actually coming from Brazil, which had become, once again, after a war, a colony of Portugal. And Portugal and Spain in the 1490s had thrown all the Jews out. Actually, in the case of Portugal, they threw them out and then they forced them to convert. So a lot of Portuguese Jews were Portuguese Catholics who had once been Jews really remained staunchly secretly Jewish. And
Mhm.
so they had lived in Brazil when it was a colony of the Dutch, not a colony of Portugal. And then the Portuguese conquer it, and they're very generous. They give them 3 months to get out. Otherwise, they're going to be tried by the Inquisition. So they come to New Amsterdam. Most of the Portuguese Jews who fled, or the Jews in Brazil, most of them actually just go to Amsterdam where they're allowed to live as Jews. So they
Mhm.
come to New Amsterdam, and Peter Stuyvesant, who's the governor of New Amsterdam, it's not yet called New York, Stuyvesant wants to kick them out. So when you say Jews were moving from places to places, often they did because either they couldn't afford to live somewhere or they weren't able to stay there or they got thrown out.
And so, is there a modicum of welcome? I mean, we know New York as modern day Americans as really, I mean, until maybe recently, maybe the most welcoming place for Jewish people. In America, in the world, maybe second to Israel. So, what was the world like, and how do they build community once the ones who manage to get there establish themselves? How do they become part of that community, and how does it go from a place where they are experiencing yet more persecution to relatively modern day where it actually ends up being a refuge of sorts, at least for a time?
You're absolutely right. So what happens is Stuyvesant doesn't get the permission to kick the Jews out. The colonies, they're so tiny then. They need colonists. They need people. He's not allowed to kick them out. And eventually more Jews come to what become the colonies and then what becomes the United States. And eventually the community grows to the size of where it is now, a significant religious minority community of somewhere between, depends on how you count it, somewhere between 6.5 and 8 million people. And in America, Jews do what they did elsewhere. They thrive. They build synagogues, they build community centers, they create schools, they raise their families, they interact with their neighbors, they serve in public office, they serve, right now the highest ranking Jew in the United States is Schumer, Senator Schumer in the Senate. And Jews, and that's what I think makes this story tough because, on the one hand, Jews thrive and succeed. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that they don't continue to face anti Jewish animosity.
Hmm. It's always an undercurrent.
Right.
Yeah. Or an overt current, I should say. There's one really interesting sort of a blurb or section in the book that stood out to me. And I'm going to say this family name, and conspiracy theorists everywhere, their ears will perk up. You talk about this evolution of attitude toward the Rothschild family. So in the 1830s, some American newspapers were actually quite favorable in their coverage of them, talking about their extraordinary financial success and the many hurdles that you were just describing that they overcame to establish themselves. But now, when you say the word Rothschild, that family name, it's really become shorthand for some really elaborate conspiracy theories about Jewish power, about Jewish influence. How does that transformation happen? And why has that narrative proven to be so durable over time?
I think it's become so durable because I think the Rothschilds, in a sense, have become the poster child for anti Semitic conspiracies, anti Semitic ideas. So, what you have to remember is this is a family in the mid 1700s. Mayor Amschel Rothschild. He actually lives in a ghetto in Frankfurt am Main. He has a whole bunch of sons, and eventually he becomes a banker, and he sends the sons to the glittering European capitals where they become a banker. But he starts out, he's very poor, and eventually, by the early 1800s, they amass a great deal of wealth. So on the one hand, you're right. There's that great article from like the 1830s where
Mhm.
they're saying, look at this amazing family and what they've been able to do and how they've been able to escape the ghetto. But then at the same time, there becomes, and some of it's coming from the left, this idea that these
Mhm.
are wealthy bankers and they're controlling not only the economy, but they're controlling the world, and they're controlling the governments, and they're controlling the wars. And so the historians look at them and say that they are really the poster child for all anti Semitic conspiracy theories. And this is before the granddaddy of all of those conspiracy theories, which is something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But that doesn't emerge till the 20th century.
We're getting to that next, which is another story. This is what I like about your book too, and I'm going to show you guys what it looks like again, and we'll link to places where you can buy. But it's an told in a storytelling way enough that it feels sort of like a blend of both history and I don't know, just it's interesting, these little snippets of stories and information that even knowing history as you think you might, you probably don't know the small threads that you are able to tell. You talk about the story of the Dearborn Independent. This is the early 20th century. You recount Henry Ford, who is dealing with a struggling publication, telling his staff to quote, find an evil, go after it, and stay after it. And the way I read it, that decision seems to ultimately have led to the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and just years of anti Semitic propaganda. So I would imagine you would call this a turning point in the history of really mainstreaming anti Semitism in America.
Absolutely. Because, first of all, what people don't remember, Henry Ford was the most famous American of his
Mhm.
day. I mean, at one point, he was even contemplating running for president. And so, whatever he said, people paid attention to, including, by the way, Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany in 1923 and beyond. And Ford, he has this newspaper for 91 weeks. He ran a column called The International Jew, the World's Problem, and eventually got translated into multiple languages. Our listeners can actually go onto Wikimedia and read all of its articles. And so he published this tract called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was created in Russia in 1903. It purports to show a cabal of Jewish leaders fomenting liberal revolutions to take over the world. Same things that were charged with the against the Rothschilds, but doesn't use the Rothschild name. And it's a fiction. I mean, we even know what it's based on, but it doesn't matter because Henry Ford publishes it. And if Henry Ford said it was in the Dearborn and it was in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, then it was true. People trusted him.
So this was like a fictionalized serial, serial, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. A fictionalized serial. But then it also included a lot of other things. Like he hated jazz. So he blamed the Jews for inventing jazz. Anything he didn't like about America, he blamed on the Jews.
It's so crazy because, this is a guy who American history books revere. I mean, there's the whole museum built to him, in Detroit. I mean, I I really think this is why it's so important to understand things from other perspectives because I know that until I started reading recently into a lot of this stuff, it's shocking to me how deeply some of this stuff runs. I mean, and again, we will get to modern times recently, but that area in particular has also become a hotbed, even in modern times, for a lot of anti Semitic type behavior. Am I
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, also, Ford is there. But then in the 1930s, Father Charles Coughlin is using his radio show to preach that, he's against FDR and to preach his hatred of the Jews.
Mm.
And eventually his bishop pulls him off even before the United States enters World War II. And Father Charles Coughlin, his church was right outside of Detroit in Royal Oak.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this next part of the book that you get to, I think, is the era that people most often associate with the dark period in our world history, when the word anti-Semitism even has a cause to be born, and we'll talk about the word itself too and how it came about. But we're talking kind of like Great Depression era, World War II, 30s, all the way up to the mid 40s. I think history kind of compresses this time period, right? We think of that period and we think hard time and then war. And it seems like when you look at the way history covers this maybe happened over the course of 2 years, but this was years of hatred fomenting, years of rhetoric, normalization, escalating hostility. Please talk us through how that process unfolded and some of the warning signs that were happening over the course of that 15, let's say 15 years, 10 to 15 years, and the warning signs that may be similar to what we're seeing today.
Right. So I can think of a couple of examples. What makes the 20s and the 30s and into World War II and even beyond, what makes them so tough is that Ford, his rhetoric sets a tone, but then what happens is there are quotas on the admission of Jews to colleges and universities, starts at the Ivy League, but extends to hundreds of schools. There are places that nobody's going to remember this. None of our listeners are going to remember this. But if you wanted to get a job or rent an apartment, you opened the newspaper every morning and
Mm,
you went to the want ads, right? And by
mm,
the way, the want ads were want ads for women, want ads for men,
mhm,
male jobs, female jobs. And anti Semitism was at your breakfast table because so many of those want ads said Christians only. Jews can't apply. I mean, even in places like in Brooklyn, where there were tons of Jews, even for jobs like secretaries and stenographers, not that anybody knows what a stenographer is any longer. And so it sets a tone. But then what we also have, especially with the rise of the Nazis, is we have the Nazis literally are trying to fund Nazi sympathizers in the United States. They're doing it through their consuls. They're doing it through engaging people like Charles Lindbergh. There's an America First movement that he's championing, and as a result, you even see street brawls where Nazis will be having these street meetings, and Jews will go, and there'll be fights between the two groups. So when you think of the moment we're in now, where you're seeing a lot of these protests on the streets of different cities, it echoes that period of the 1930s, echoes the period before World War II.
I'm thinking of the story that just went viral where a young man who recently graduated from college, I think it was he was applying and withdrew his application when he found out that maybe the founder of the company was Jewish. I can't remember, but
Yeah,
yes, these
he would be
split.
working for a Jew. He refused to work
Yes.
for a Jew. Exactly, exactly. So what we have is, again, we have those exclusions. There's been huge discussion. My neck of the world is really the book world, the publishing world, and a huge discussion over just the past couple of weeks where Pen America published an article where they interviewed 30 Jewish literary creatives, and they talked about how they've been boycotted. The author, an agent in Israel, has not been able to sell a single Jewish fiction book in since October 7th. And so what we're seeing again is we're seeing these unofficial,
Mhm,
well, or these boycotts that are essentially emerging from the ground up.
mm.
Whereas some of them that, for example, the restrictive covenants about where Jews could live, those actually were entrenched in law in an
Mhm.
earlier period.
Yeah. I'm really anxious to get to the post October 7th world. I know you said your book started, the research for your book started after the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. So it actually goes back a little further back in time. But before we do that, we cannot skip over what is most broadly associated with the period in time that's most broadly associated with Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, which is, of course, the Holocaust and everything that happened in World War II. Let's talk about that period of time. We come out, America, meaning as the hero in this character, as the character in the story. It's like, oh, America is the one who blah blah blah. It was never that simple, as we know, but we do know that after World War II and after people were finally able to be free of the evil that was happening there, Jews did thrive in America. And there was a time, maybe up until, and you could tell me whether that is the Tree of Life or October 7th, up till a recent time where Jews seem to have found a place where it, and I can't speak for the community, but maybe where they seemed to feel safe after World War II. Can you talk about that period at all? And
Right.
am I characterizing this correctly or no?
You're definitely characterizing it correctly, so correctly that American Jews have been arguing, starting in the 2020s, we've been arguing about when did the golden age end. So we were
Mm,
talking about what the reason. So is first of all, let me tell you, 1945, the minute 1945 hits and the war is over, anti-Semitism doesn't go away in America. And in fact, it really crops up again. But what happens in those post-war years is that those structural discriminations against Jews become illegal. All of a sudden, there's fair educational acts. You cannot discriminate against students who are applying to college and universities. There are fair housing acts. You cannot put an ad that says Christians only should rent this apartment. And ultimately, the 1964 Civil Rights Act becomes protective of Jews as well as people of color and preventing them from discrimination and also women. I mean, it says, you can't
mhm.
discriminate in employment against women. So if for Jews, all of a sudden, all these barriers that existed, they're knocked down and they flood in. And so there's the perception that anti Semitism is gone, that Jews have complete and full access to the United States everywhere. And there are so many markers of that people kind of just ignored the markers that showed that there was still examples of Jew hatred. And I'll give you one example. I was talking to a colleague one day, another professor, and he grew up like in the 70s and 80s, New Jersey. And I said, did you ever experience anti-Semitism? He says, nah, never. And then he says, well, there was that one time where those guys stole a bulldozer and they bulldozed the wall of the brand new synagogue in my town. And so then I went looking in the newspapers of the time, and I saw them. They also wrote on one of the walls, they didn't bulldoze into the ovens with the Jews. So Jews
Mm,
succeeded and they entered society, but Jew hatred continued to percolate underneath.
yeah. I just, yeah. I mean, we could spend some more time on the Holocaust period and the period directly after when Jews are reintegrated. But I know that I was shocked again to learn that, I mean, America had denied entry to Jews right before all of the really terrible things started happening with the concentration camps and things, and even afterward. I just keep going back to this question, Pamela. How much can one group of people take? This
Right.
it feels
Yeah.
like no other. Gr- Am I wrong? I mean, and again, this is an outsider looking in. There could be broader, issue. There could be something I'm missing, but has there ever been one group of people who has been so repeatedly brutalized in every corner of the world? And I'm not saying that with pity or judgment or any sense. I'm in shock looking at a history when it's all in one book like this. You're like, wow. So it turns out this has been happening forever. And as a non-Jew, I am stunned.
I would say so. Starting with your comment about the United States barring immigrants, and right now we're also in the middle of major controversy in the United States over immigration, and the United States since the late 19th century has had a major debate over whether or not immigrants should be welcomed to this country. And what happened in the 1930s when Jews, including Anne Frank's family, are trying to get out and come to America is that America had it had enacted immigration legislation that restricted the number of people who could come in. By the way, Jews from Eastern Europe, but essentially Eastern Europeans and Southern Italians or Italians in general. And also, it even had laws about Asians, wouldn't allow any immigration from Asia. So this is part of a bigger story, but there's no question that the Jews were specifically targeted in terms of that immigration debate. We're just seeing it play out again right now in our own time.
You said that the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh was a turning point for you to want to look into this. I think the broader public became more aware of things after October 7th, which is sort of the next period in time that I'd like to bring the conversation to, which is how anti-Semitism looks now. Um, so this happens it was 2023, I believe, right? Yeah, 3 years ago. Um, what is the first thing that goes through your head waking up to that news?
Okay. Should I say something about Tree of Life? I'm not sure all our listeners will
Yeah,
remember it.
absolutely. And let's give them some context. I knew this story from working in the news
Yeah,
world
you're
at the
from
time, but
Pittsburgh.
let's refresh everyone's memory because this is another modern event that I think brought this to the
Right.
forefront.
Yeah. On a Saturday morning, Jews worship in their synagogues on Saturday mornings. In the synagogue building of the Tree of Life in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood in Pittsburgh, a white nationalist who left his screed on the social media, he burst into a synagogue and he murdered 11 people while they were at prayer. And it in some ways this was a major turning point for the American Jewish community. I need to tell you that American Jews have long been worried about being attacked. There's no question. I mean, my children went to a Jewish day school, and in the early 2000s, every morning bomb sniffing dogs went through the building because to keep them safe. And if you look
This
at
was when, Pamela? Like
early
around what time?
2000s, late
Wow.
90s, early
Wow.
2000s. And if you walk by a synagogue, whether it's in New York City or it's in Pittsburgh or it's in the suburbs, not far from where I live, I mean, there are guards outside synagogues and there are concrete barriers so trucks can't ram into them. This has been a long-standing problem. It emerges in the U.S. more recently because of these violent attacks. So this murder at the Tree of Life synagogue really sent a shockwave across America's Jews. It's the deadliest attack on American Jews so far. And it came from a white nationalist who hated Jews and hated immigrants. But when we moved to October 7th, the shock of October 7th, which didn't shock me because I had been watching the anti-Israel, anti-Zionism coming from the left for a long time. It comes straight out of the Soviet Union in the 1960s to the United States. But I was horrified, of course, because this was the kind of attack that Jews had endured in the pogroms in Europe, in the Holocaust. It was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. 1,200 people were murdered, 250 were taken hostages. The youngest was under the age of 1. The oldest was a man in his 80s. And it unleashed, as I am know that convinced that the attackers expected, it unleashed a horrific war, but it also unleashed a media campaign against Jews around the world, and particularly in the United States.
Yeah, do you hear plenty of coverage on what happened October 8th and the immediate reactions, often, as we like to say, victim blaming reactions that started in the immediate aftermath. It was shocking to me. Is there anything that comes to mind when you look back on how media covered it or even how people responded on social media? And that's going to, of course, vary on based on what your algorithm looks like. But just recounting some of the immediate reactions you saw after October 7th.
The immediate reaction that was the most shocking, of course, because I'm a professor, was 30 Harvard student organizations signed on to a statement blaming Israel for the violence, blaming Israel for the attack, and saying that the occupation of Gaza, which, by the way, Israel did not occupy Gaza at that point. They did at one point, but they had pulled out. They blamed Israel and Zionism for everything that had happened since then. And of course, this is part of this long-standing anti-Zionist campaign. It's so much so that now there are student policies at certain schools that recognize that calling a Jew Zionist, that they're using it essentially as an epithet. That it's not that that what they do is they say that they're not anti-Semitic, but they're only anti-Zionist. But we know that over 90% of American Jews, every time there's a survey, they believe Israel has a right to exist. And
I
part of it's because they need a place if they have to go somewhere.
Yeah, I think that I really wanted to spend some time on this too because this thread is really, really complicated, not really complicated, but interesting kind of in and of itself, which is the whole anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism. And you will see so many people, particularly on social media, come out and say, I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm just against Israel and I'm just against fill in the blank, whatever phrase they choose to use to shorthand the discussion. If you were talking to someone, and I got into a conversation with someone once and they were like, oh, well, that sounds pretty Zionist. And I'm like, do you mean like, do I think Jewish people should like exist safely? Okay. Like, I'm as again, as an outsider, I was like, what is confusing about this? And yet it is still something that people are really, really digging their claws into. So start by explaining what Zionism even is and why it became so entwined with everything that it has been in the course of this discussion.
Yeah. Zionism was the national movement for a Jewish state. I mean, it's created in the late 1890s, but it's built on the historic connection that Jews have to that land, to the land of now it's called Israel or Israel Palestine, but Jews, their homeland is the land of Zion. Jerusalem was their capital. And every year, Jews have yearned across the millennia. They've ended, their Passover Seders with next year in Jerusalem, meaning yearning to go back to Jerusalem. You'll often find that Jews who live elsewhere, they actually, when they die, their bodies are flown to be buried in their historic homeland. So
Hmm.
there's a millennial old Jewish connection to the land. Jews continue to live there. There were always Jews who were inhabitants of the land, even after it was conquered by Muhammad's armies, even if it was conquered by the Crusaders, then by the Ottomans. Jews have always been there. But the movement, the modern movement, it's part of modern nationalist movements. The modern movement was a late 19th century movement that recognized that there was so much Jew hatred in Europe that Jews had to have their own state to protect them. So Jews move there. They're not. I mean, yes, they colonized. They settled there, but they're not. They're not. The British who are creating colonies to milk them for their resources. They settle there and they build up the foundations of what becomes a community, and that after World War II, the United Nations, was the British who had held the mandate on the land. The British say, we can't solve this problem, just like they held the mandate over India. We can't solve this problem. You have to solve this problem. And so the United Nations says we're going to have two states. We're going to have an Arab state. They were using the word Arab, not Palestine at that point. We're going to have an Arab state and we're going to have a Jewish state. The Jews accept it. The Arabs say no. The Jews proclaim their independence in the Declaration of the Independence of State of Israel in May of 1948, and 5 Arab armies invade. And the Israelis survived, and they have survived multiple wars, multiple attacks, including the most recent one. And The issue is today, 45% of the world's Jews live in Israel. If there is no Jewish state, where are they going to go?
Yeah, how has it become a bad word is what I'm curious about
Mhm.
too.
Yeah, it's become an epithet. It's become a bad word because it's a way of expressing, kind of in shorthand and code, opposition to the existence of the state of Israel. And what nobody remembers is that after 1948, there were about 800,000 Jews living in the Middle East and in North Africa. And the conditions in Algeria, Morocco, Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, Yemen became so impossible
Mm.
that they fled. They were either pushed out or they fled. So today, about half the population of Israel, not hailed from Europe, they are either immigrants or the children of immigrants who came from the Middle East and North Africa. So every time you hear, oh, the Zionists are white settler colonists, they're not. They come from the Middle East and North Africa, and they had no place else to go.
A lot of the conversations that are happening about this topic are happening on American college campuses, and I know this is something you also know a ton about. What it's so broad, it's hard to just like ask a few questions, but what are people who are using that argument getting wrong? And setting aside, and I do want to take a moment and recognize how painful it must be as a Jewish American to walk through campus and hear the things that they're hearing. The emotion of the question set aside, what if you could go to a group of a lot of these encampments that were happening, particularly right after October 7th, what and know that one argument you could make would stick, what would that argument be?
What I would ask as a faculty member is I would ask for complexity, for understanding that that this is an intractable situation, that there's been horrific suffering on both sides, and that despite the best efforts, for example, President Clinton was very, very close to creating a Palestinian state, that there needs to be a way for the two peoples to figure out how to create two states in that area. But I'm really convinced that at this point that two-state solution is dead in the water. And because it was dead in the water in 1948 when the British tried to the UN tried to create it.
And again, this could be a separate podcast series entirely, but why? Why is it so hard? And again, I think it's important to understand, at least I can only speak for myself. I'm coming at this from a Western mindset where we have a very live and let live attitude. There is a separation between religion and state. There is an appreciation for different viewpoints, etc. It is really hard for the modern Western mind to conceptualize how difficult could it be to share a piece of land? And yet it is the most persistent problem, maybe in the history of the world. This one tract that cannot, for some reason, the problem behind it cannot be solved. If you were to, again, in a very news for normies kind of normal person way, explain like, why is it so hard?
Right. I mean, honestly, I wish I could explain why it's so hard. There are other terrible conflicts going on at the moment in Sudan, the Chinese persecution of the Uyghurs. But the reality is that for some reason, this has captured the world's imagination. I've often tell my students, like, if somebody came down from Mars and they read our media, they would think that Israel is the size of China and the former Soviet Union combined because of how present it is. I do think that what we are dealing with is this classic animosity against Jews, no matter who they are, where they live, how you define it, and it's become a social movement. And young people on campus want to be in the right. They want to join the right social movement. And everybody's blaming the faculty for doing this. But most of these kids, they never take a course with the faculty who are, creating kind of the ideological line campus today are either in STEM or business.
Hmm.
And but they join the demonstrations, they wear the keffiyehs, and many there are Jewish kids doing this, and they want if they're not calling for the end of the state of Israel, what they want is a one state solution where everybody will be equal in the country. The reality is that that will lead to the end of the Jewish community there, and it's not just because of the violence, but it's because of the reality that of the demographic reality.
Yeah, I was doing some reading and listening to this too. Something else I just learned is, yes, if it came to that situation, just numbers alone, they would be completely, I don't wanna say, like, minimized is the wrong word, but in the minority, I guess is the word, and anything that they would want from a governmental perspective or cultural perspective could essentially be easily erased if that were to happen. And I think, gosh, this again, this I wish I could do a whole separate podcast conversation about this because this issue alone is so complex, but I do wanna leave it behind before we talk about anti-Semitism in modern politics and kind of put a bow on it to the best that we can. And what I'm hearing you say is, I think a lot of us in a perfect world would want to see some sort of coexistence. But what I'm hearing from you is there's not a lot of hope that that is in our near future, despite the best laid plans and, President Trump with his 20-point thing and all the nations signing on to support or to do this and that. What is your prognosis for what lies ahead in regards to this particular situation, say over the next 5 years?
Right. I mean, in the 90s with the Oslo Accords, I was very optimistic. I really thought, I mean, we were very, very close to having the creation of two states. And now I just don't see that. I mean, every time there's surveys done, at one point, Israelis were more interested in a two-state solution than they are now. And the Palestinians actually have never really been interested in a two-state solution. If they were, they would have taken that deal that Clinton had offered. So I am unfortunately not optimistic. What I hope I can be optimistic about is that we can lessen the temperature on
Mm.
anti-Semitism worldwide. That's
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do.
On that note, social media is somewhere where we see a lot of discourse about this. I happen to see a lot of people talking about trying to draw this distinction between I am not against, any individual Jewish person. I am only against the actions of the Israeli government, et cetera. Some form of that argument. What do you say to people who are publicly speaking like that, and what are they missing, if anything, in your view?
First of all, it's acceptable to oppose the actions of any government, right? We've had demonstrations in the United States, the No Kings demonstrations. If as long as we're not in an authoritarian situation, we're in a democracy, people can oppose the actions of the government, and they do, and they should. The difference is when it spills over into violence. And what we've had in the United States recently, like I talked about a little while ago, is we've had these violent attacks against Jewish people who are the perpetrators. At one in Pittsburgh, came from the right, but the perpetrators now are coming from the left. And I live outside of Washington, D.C. And in May of 2025, a beautiful young couple was gunned down as they left an event at the Capitol Jewish Museum, a social event where Jews who worked in politics in DC could meet one another. And that really, and the young woman who was murdered, Sarah Milgram, graduated my university. And that just showed where this rhetoric, this constant drumbeat, where they say, I'm not anti Semitic, I'm only anti Zionist, this constant drumbeat is allowing violence to break out. Rhetoric, you can't disassociate anti Semitic rhetoric or anti Zionist rhetoric from anti Semitic violence.
Yeah, and we're not seeing it only happen in the US. I just covered a couple of stories in my newsletter that went out. We're recording this on July 27th, so this may be dated by the time people hear it, but a deadly attack in Berlin that leaders in Germany are saying was motivated by religious hatred, stabbing in New York earlier this week. I know that there are agencies who have tracked um, violent attacks and violence against minority groups in particular, and they consistently recently have shown that anti-Semitic attacks are by far and large at the top of that list, and that remains the case to this day. So, uh, what I'm wondering is, are we back in the 30s, Pamela? I mean, we talked a little while about the period of 10 to 15 years where things were small at first, and then when things finally took root, they got big, and they got big quick. So, are we back there?
History, the good thing about being a historian is I know that history doesn't repeat. It echoes from the past into the present. And we are hearing those echoes, but we're hearing them because in the 30s, the anti-Semitism, especially in America, but also in Europe, it came from the right primarily, although not in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union came from the left, but in America, it came primarily from the right. So we're hearing those echoes, but we're also hearing are the echoes from the Soviet Union's exportation of its anti-Zionism in the 1960s to the United States and its client states around the world. So I won't say it's the same, but it's definitely rhyming from the past.
Just a couple more questions because this topic is so big, and we'll wind back up and kind of with another look forward. But I'm curious your opinion on this theory that there is an infiltration of money coming in from foreign actors who are subsidizing bot farms, say on social media, to create hateful rhetoric on Instagram and on TikTok, or these nefarious actors that are quite literally permeating the minds of young America. Do you buy into that theory that that's part of what's happening, that the attack isn't coming from guns and mortars and missiles, but is rather slowly seeping in through our phone screens?
Well, I definitely think it's seeping in through social media. There's absolutely no question. And the reality is that even if the US were to pass laws controlling social media is a global, it's global. So so young people, and I'm not on social media that much, but they're going to be hearing this stuff. No, it's just going to come in, even if the big social media firms like Meta, even if they did something. But what's interesting, as a historian, is that new media has always spread anti-Semitism. The printing press spread Jew hatred, and then the radio spread both in Germany and in the United States spread Jew hatred. So social media is the medium of the moment. But if I had a solution to the social media problem, I would have a
Yeah.
totally different job at a much higher pay grade.
I was going to say, is there an inoculation against that? But I guess not. You're right. You'd be rich and we could all just walk away with a happy, peaceful world. But I guess there's no fix for that. Well, the fix is intelligence and education, and I don't think people on on Instagram are looking for that at the moment. Two more questions before we wrap things up here. I'm sorry for taking up time, but you're just a wealth of information here. Do you have any concern about the rise of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, whose candidates, at least in some cities, have really, really professed strong feelings against Israel and have made foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, a huge part of their platform, even though they're running for Congress or some sort of seat in America? Any
Yeah,
concern
or
there?
the mayor of New York, right?
Yeah. Oh, we're gonna get to him too. Don't you worry.
Um, I mean, I certainly have tremendous concerns because it seems, and I can't tell if this is mostly because I read a lot of Jewish media, but it seems that the primary issue in so many of these campaigns is the candidate's position on Israel. Does it have a right to exist? Does the United States have a right to remain its ally? So I certainly have tremendous concerns about what has happened there. And I also, and I mentioned this to you earlier, I just published an article where I kind of looked at Hassan Piker, this huge social media influencer with 3 million followers on Twitch, and who said, boldly says, I am not an anti-Semite. He says he condemns attacks on synagogues. He condemns graffiti of swastikas on student buildings of Jewish organizations. But then he traffics in classic anti-Semitic tropes. He says anyone who has any sympathy for Zionism should never even be a dog catcher. And so I look at that and I'm going, well, that sounds to me like he's saying, let's not have Jews in politics, or let's not, let's boycott Jews again. They're not allowed to have positions in their local governments.
Yeah.
And I, so I, and that, and he was a featured speaker at the College Democrats convention.
Yeah, getting plenty of friendly coverage in the New York Times as well, interestingly, or maybe not
Yeah.
interestingly. Mom Donnie in New York City getting a lot of headlines over the past couple of weeks because he ran on this campaign promise. I will arrest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he steps foot in New York City, even though that reality that possibility was really never a reality. But it is something that, again, we're seeing American politicians campaign on a lot of these foreign policy issues. Of course, when push comes to shove, as everyone predicted, that was not a possibility. However, this stance got him a ton of press coverage, traction, etc. Your take on the promise that never could have been from Mayor Mamdani?
Oh, my take is that he's running for national office. That there's no question that that's what that's the position he's staking out. And I've read the statements from the leading rabbis of some of New York's most important synagogues, and all of them asking for him to turn down the rhetoric and turn down the temperature, because there was a man who was stabbed, a Jewish, identifiably Jewish man, because he was wearing the Jewish head covering, the yarmulke, and an Asian American man, and they were both stabbed on the Upper West Side just within the past couple of days by somebody who yelled "Allahu Akbar."
Mm. Do you have hope, or do your friends in positions of religious influence in New York City have any hope that Mayor Mamdani will take that cue and maybe use gentler language or parse his words a little bit more?
I That's not where I invest my hope, because I don't know. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't even live in New York. Where I do have hope is I'm doing a lot of work where I am educating educators
Mm.
about Jews and anti-Semitism. There are all these dedicated teachers and faculty and administrators from higher education who are spending part of their summer or a full day workshop during the academic year, where they're trying, basically the way you're trying to educate your audience. They're trying to understand a phenomenon that they never really needed to understand because it wasn't so significant. And I am in awe of what they're doing. And I consider it a real privilege to be in conversation with them. And I've been in Milwaukee and Boston, and I'm going to Philly, and in Washington. I mean, there are so many of these initiatives, and that's what gives me hope, because they can get the message out to their students.
And is there a way for people listening who might be interested in connecting with you on that to reach out, or what's
Yeah.
the deal
Just
there?
email me. I mean, I'm pretty good on email.
Okay, I'll include your email in show notes. And Pamela, before I let you go, is there anything we missed? Is there any? I love that we ended on a hopeful note, and I happen to agree that this is something where education and nuance will save the day. Is there anything else we missed that you want people to know? And again, anything that I might have mischaracterized, or anything you just want to leave the interview, the note you
Oh,
want to leave
I
the
mean,
interview?
thank you, first of all, for finding my book, Antisemitism in American Tradition. Thank you for wanting to share it with your audience. And I never thought I would write a book that was going to hit the moment that we're in the way this one has.
Yeah, it really has. And I encourage anybody who's curious about any of this history to check it out. I've been holding it up. And of course, I will link it in show notes as well. Pamela, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this latest episode of We Gotta Talk. Please leave a rating and review. Those help our show to get out to people who might find it useful and or entertaining. Thank you so much for your support of this show, and please follow along on Instagram @SunnyAbata, or check out the blog at wegottatalk.com/blog.